so towards the future, so as to understand the resilience of democratic and liberal economies, a speaker which is awaiting for us, and with Pedro Faustino chairing the session.
Olá, boa tarde.
So good afternoon, welcome once again. So we're committed to speaking about democracy and liberal economy. And such as I've mentioned, this talk will be with Professor Francis Fukuyama. He's a political economist, which is quite influential in defending democratic aspects. Also received awards. He was director of the Center for Democracy and Development and Rule of Law. I apologize, but I have to read his biography. He has collaborated quite often with the U.S. Department and different governments all over the world. So I'm going to speak to him in English.
Dear colleagues, please welcome Professor Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor Fukuyama. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Good. Professor, welcome to our Congress, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here with us today. I know you are in California, so it's 8 hours earlier than in Lisbon. So good morning, and thank you for
good afternoon to you.
Thank you for your extra effort to be with us so early in the morning. Professor, we'd like to promote a discussion with you about the trends of political and social organization in the world, namely about the resilience of liberal democracies. And to start, the first question I would like to ask you is, can you please help us to clarify what do you mean by liberalism? Because you have some misunderstandings about the concept, and exactly where do you stand in this regard?
Sure. So the term liberalism has different meanings in different parts of the world. In the United States, it means that you're left of center, but in Europe, it mostly means that you're center-right. You want low taxes, you want less government regulation, this sort of thing. I have a different definition of liberalism that isn't connected to the economic model necessarily. A liberal believes that the power of states ought to be limited to respect individual rights, and that all human beings basically are entitled to the same degree of dignity as every other human being. There's no particular group of people that has a privilege over other people, and that dignity is recognized by rights. A liberal state grants rights to its citizens, and it uses the law, the rule of law, to protect those rights against governments, against other individuals that might want to violate those rights. And as long as you have that kind of structure based on law, then you can have a relatively large state like Sweden or Denmark or Norway, or you can have a much smaller state like, let's say, the United States or maybe Japan. And that's really, for me, what counts as a liberal society.
Very well. So thank you for the clarification. So it's not only about paying less taxes or have a smaller government. Thank you. Professor Fukuyama, I would like now to ask you to focus a little more on Europe, because it's our region. And it's well known that Europe has a complex political organization, sometimes a slow decision-making process. To what extent can this decision-making process create conditions to the rise of populism or authoritarianism in Europe?
Well, I think this is a problem not just in Europe, but in the United States and other liberal countries. Because liberalism is based on law, everything happens according to rules. We don't like giving a lot of discretionary authority to individual political leaders, but it means that it's very difficult sometimes to come to collective decisions. And there tends to be a focus in many liberal democracies to be very procedural, to follow bureaucratic rules or to put things through very complex judicial processes. You can see this, for example, in building infrastructure, where you've got lots and lots of safeguards and permitting requirements that make it very slow to create things. At the other end of the spectrum is a country like China, which is a dictatorship. They don't really have rules. The Chinese government can do largely what it wants, and it means that they can build things very quickly. The problem is that there's a good reason for having all those rules and safeguards, because you want to prevent governments or large corporations from simply overwhelming the environment, not caring for worker safety, all of these sorts of things. But I do think that as a result, voters get frustrated because their governments are not producing the kinds of results that they would like to see. And I think that it's really incumbent on many liberal democracies to try to come up with ways to focus more on outcomes, on results, rather than simply complying with a lot of existing rules, and to make the decision-making process much more efficient. Now, in Europe, you've got a further problem, because in addition to all the national level governments, you've also got the European Union and the EU Commission and the Parliament and a whole set of extra decision-making bodies. In some respects, that's good, because you can act as a complete body of 450 million people that has a lot of power, both as a market but also as a potential political actor. But I think that because of the internal rules in Europe, where in an area like foreign policy, every member state has a veto, sometimes it's extremely hard to make decisions, and therefore the policies that come out of the EU are sometimes very unsatisfactory because they're slow.
Very well, yes, that's a fact. Professor Fukuyama, you talk about regulation, and because we are in a technological congress specifically dedicated to artificial intelligence, the $1 million question is technology and AI in particular something good for democracy and for liberalism, or on the other hand, a threat?
Well, I feel that this kind of question that everybody is posing right now is a little bit like asking the question, what is the effect of electricity going to be back in the 1880s when electricity was first being introduced? It's very, very hard to foresee the downstream effects of so big a development as artificial intelligence. I think that, obviously a lot of people are worried that it's going to destroy jobs, it's going to make people's skills unnecessary, it's going to even be smarter than human beings. On the other hand, I think that there are a lot of possibilities where instead of competing for human intelligence, artificial intelligence is going to complement what people can do already. You can already see this in the case of generative AI, where people that are not that good at writing can all of a sudden, produce text that is very usable. And in that respect, it may actually help people, produce things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to, and it would actually decrease inequality in the world. But the bigger issue, I think, is how we deal with this as governments, how we regulate it. Europe likes to regulate things more than the United States does, and they've already moved ahead in kind of outlining a framework for regulation. There's an executive order in the US that tries to do something similar, but it's a little bit less ambitious. And I would say that we need to be a little careful about that, because we really don't know what the social and political impacts of AI are going to be. We have all these fears and projections, but we don't really have much experience with the reality. And I think it's very hard to write rules, any kind of detailed rules to govern a technology whose impact and whose harms you don't really understand. I think that if you think about this in the longer run, if you regulate artificial intelligence, it's going to require human judgment in many ways. I don't think that you can write rules that will anticipate the future effects of artificial intelligence. Certainly you can't write detailed rules like we have for many other sectors of the economy. And you run a big danger of unduly constraining the development of the technology if you are preventing it from doing things, from experimenting, from innovating, and the like. My personal preference is that we approach regulation of AI rather cautiously. We need to worry about it. I think some of the bigger fears that it's going to lead to an existential crisis and will destroy the human race are a little bit premature. We need to focus on the near-term potential harms, but we also need to realize that like electricity back in the 19th century, it's very difficult to really see what some of the concrete harms and benefits are going to be.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. But there's another dimension on this discussion about AI, which is the dimension of the scale of investment necessary to develop it. And there are not many companies that have the resources to do that kind of investment. So we tend to see larger and larger tech companies taking care of these investments. Do you think that the growth of these companies may be another issue in terms of the impact of these technologies in the economical balance of the world?
Well, definitely. I think that we ought to worry when private corporations become really, really large and therefore politically powerful as well as economically powerful. We've seen this happen with the big internet platforms, Facebook or Meta, Google, and X or Twitter already, which have ended up playing an important role in our democracy, and not always a positive role. And it was a consequence that very few people foresaw when the internet was first privatized in the 1990s. A lot of people, myself included, thought that the internet would be good for democracy because it would spread power out, it would give access to information to many ordinary people. And we didn't foresee the way that it could be weaponized and used as an instrument of political conflict. I think that AI actually makes the problem worse. In the early days, building large models required large populations, which gave, the United States or especially China a big leg up because they had huge amounts of data that they could train models on. I think now you've also got this problem that the machines themselves are so expensive. Fei-Fei Li, who is a Stanford computer scientist that is the co-director of our Human-Centered AI Institute, wrote an article earlier this year in which she noted that Stanford University cannot afford to purchase one of the machines that's used to train large language models just because it's beyond the fiscal capacity of the university. And so when Stanford, which is the leading academic institution studying artificial intelligence, can't afford to experiment with the most advanced hardware that is used, that's a problem. I mean, it means that it's only the private sector that's going to be able to really make use of these technologies. And the government really hasn't stepped up. Potentially the government could be the sponsor of these forms of technology. But right now, this is all in the hands of the private sector. I don't think that this is an immediate danger, but it does make you worry that governments, down the road are really not going to be able to control the technology if they needed to do so. The other thing is that it enters into geopolitics, because clearly there is a two-tier world now in which you have large countries, primarily the US and China, that have the resources and the populations to work with artificial intelligence, and smaller companies and smaller countries really don't have, you know, either the financial means or the data, accumulated data to be able to work with artificial intelligence. And then I think finally it's going to enter into the geopolitical competition. It has already, because you know, there was a movement at the beginning of the Biden administration to try to use competition law, antitrust law, to weaken the power of some of the large internet platforms. Biden appointed a number of very pro-antitrust regulators like Lena Khan, you know, to the Federal Trade Commission to, in a way, rein in these companies. But now there's an argument that we shouldn't be doing this, because if we regulate our own companies and don't let them grow as large as they can, then the Chinese will simply do it, and we will lose this technological competition with China. I don't know what the answer to this is, but I do think that, you know, the fact that the technology is now global and the competition is global really changes the considerations for any given country as to how, you know, to what degree they want to try to regulate that sector.
Yeah. So we have a geopolitical environment where you have to take into account now private companies and the big tech companies. Professor, I'd like now to come to a different topic. We have gone through this in the morning a little bit. 2024 is a very particular year in history because we have a number of very critical moments happening in the world. I'd like to hear you a little bit about that.
Well, I'm very worried about the future of actually the democratic order throughout the world. You know, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the fact that the Ukrainians held out against Russia and were doing very well, the fact that NATO had come together to support Ukraine very strongly, the fact that the United States was leading the alliance in providing that support was very encouraging, and it seemed very inspiring that here was a country that had not rejected democracy, but in fact was embracing it and was under threat, but was defending itself very bravely. But you know, one of the big challenges we have right now is that many of the threats to democracy are not simply international. It's not just authoritarian great powers like China and Russia that are threats, but it's also the rise of populist movements within existing democracies. And I think you saw the geopolitical consequences of this over the winter, where the Republican Party basically turned its back on Ukraine, refused to vote money for further weapons going to Ukraine, and as a result, the momentum in the war shifted from Ukraine to Russia. Now, you know, 2-3 weeks ago, Congress finally corrected that. They finally agreed to supply weapons once again, but unfortunately, thousands of Ukrainians got killed because of that gap, and right now they're racing to close the ammunition deficit that they have with Russia. It's not clear that they're going to be able to do that very effectively. The other big problem, of course, is that we're not just facing one big war, we're facing several potential ones. We have a very live, hot war in Gaza, which does not have a clear outcome and does not have a game plan for, you know, a long-term settlement. You have a potential conflict in the Far East over Taiwan, which at the moment is quiescent, but it could burst into an active military conflict, you know, at any moment. And I think that it's a combination of internal and external threats that is particularly worrisome, where geopolitics is directly reflected in the internal politics of the leading democracy, the United States, and where one of the two big political parties looked like it was switching sides in a global contest between democracy and autocracy. And, I think in general that's been the weakest aspect of the US as a global power, that it can't make up its own mind what role it wants to play, whether it wants to continue to play this role as the leading democracy in an alliance, global alliance of democracies, or whether it wants to return to isolationism and not be involved and therefore let other countries dominate their regions.
So we have liberal democracies and liberal economies at stake this year. Going back to the economy, Professor Fukuyama, we tend to associate in the Western world liberal economies with economic performance. But my question is, do we have evidences that liberalism and democracy are better for economic performance?
I think we've got a ton of evidence. I think there shouldn't be any question about this. I mean, you just look at China. China is not a liberal political system. They don't have a lot of individual rights and personal freedoms, but beginning in 1978, Deng Xiaoping liberalized the Chinese economy. He disbanded collective farms. He essentially let peasants keep the earnings that they had made on their family plots. And the output of Chinese agriculture quadrupled within the space of 2 or 3 years. And it's very hard to see a clear example where liberal economic policies led immediately to economic growth. Something very similar happened in India over the last 2 decades, where you had an overly regulated Indian economy that was liberalized beginning in stages in the 1990s, and it's now the fastest growing large economy in the world. And I think that there are just too many examples of this kind of performance to deny that liberal economic policies promote economic growth. Now, the trick, I think, for liberal democracies is that economic growth is not the only social good they seek. They also want to control the degree of equality or the inequality that market economies tend to produce. They want to provide social services for their populations, and a lot of those social policies are expensive, and they lead to, at times lower growth. And so balancing equality and growth has always been a challenge. But I think that, the biggest successes of the last 70 years have been precisely in that formula, where you tie a market economy that respects property rights and rule of law, to a democratic system that provides social protections for people that are harmed or left behind by the growth of the rest of the economy. And that's a winning, that's a very winning formula. Liberalism just by itself, if all you have is free markets and property rights, but no democratic system that can, soften the impact of a market economy, then that's not going to, you may get very rapid growth, but you're not going to get a lot of social justice. And interestingly, one of the most unequal countries right now is China. Its Gini coefficient is, somewhere above 50. I mean, it's comparable to Brazil, in terms of the inequality that's been produced. And one of the reasons for that, strangely enough, for a communist form, or at least a country that still thinks of itself as communist, is the fact that they don't have a very strong social safety net in terms of pensions, healthcare, education, particularly in the rural parts of China. And so in a sense, they've got the worst of all worlds. They've got a government that wants to regulate their tech sector excessively, but then they don't have adequate social protections to promote inequality, and as a result, they've got a very unbalanced kind of society. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. That there's no question that liberal economic policies in the long run are really the only way that you can maintain a rich, modern, healthy economy.
So the issue is to balance between economic growth and equality. Professor Fukuyama, the time is unfortunately running very fast. I have a last question for you, perhaps a rather complicated question for a 2 minutes answer, but I know you'll do your best. And the question is, we are in a Congress of business leaders, private companies mostly. In your opinion, what is our role as business leaders in defending the values of liberalism and democracy?
Well, I think that, Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist, wrote this famous article back in the 1970s that the primary duty of any private company is to maximize profits, and that the greatest social good would be achieved that way. And I think that we've seen that that's really not the case, that if business leaders only think about efficiency and maximization of profits for their owners, you're going to get a lot of unfortunate social effects in terms of greater inequality. And ultimately, it's going to turn political. You're going to get the rise of populist parties that don't like the inequality and basically want to undermine that system. Sometimes they come from the left and sometimes they come from the right. And so I think that business leaders have a responsibility to think about the societies in which they are embedded and to shape their policies not just for the sake of profit maximization, but in order to have an environment where they can flourish, where they don't generate a huge amount of opposition, where they're socially responsible. These days with the threat of climate change, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of private sector buy-in to policies that will mitigate that. And that's the way I think any corporate CEO really needs to think about his or her role in a modern democracy.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure and honor to have you among us today. Hope to see you soon in Portugal.
Okay,
Thank you.
I hope to return. Thank you very much.